You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
From Mamma Mia, this is No Filter, and I'm Claire Murphy. If the name Megan Phelps-Roper doesn't immediately ring a bell for you, her former church and home just might. The incredibly controversial and almost universally despised Westboro Baptist Church.
The Westboro Baptist Church is known for picketing the funerals of U.S. soldiers and Marines in protest over what the church sees as the ills of American society.
The Westboro Baptist Church is one of America's most notorious religious hate groups.
Hers is the family who pickets the funerals of gay murder victims, those who've died from AIDS and soldiers killed in battle, to demonstrate their belief that God punishes the US for its tolerance of homosexuality, even in the military. The blunt and offensive messaging on those signs, telling passers-by exactly who they hate, captured the world's attention and catapulted the Westboro Baptist Church into the public sphere, alongside documentaries and profiles made by the likes of Louis Theroux and Keith Allen.
I'd seen some of the youngest members of the clan holding placards, and I wondered how much of the message they actually understood.
How old are you, Shirley?
7.
7. Do you know what the sign means? No. Shirley? She doesn't know what it means.
Megan was raised in the church, and from just 5 years of age, barely big enough to hold the placards that spouted hateful and bizarre messages of their vengeful God, was on the picket line day and night, hoping to save those her family believed needed saving. As she got older, she would become the face of the church's younger generation, alongside her mum Shirley and grandfather and church founder Fred Phelps.
Well, we're not angry. What we're trying to do is get the point across to people who hate our message, who hate us, who hate God, who hate his judgments. That's why we have to get
a little defiant.
Yeah.
Because we have to make sure, if you're going to hear us, that we talk loud enough to be heard, because you cut us off before we say the words because you don't like the words.
And it's not just you, it's everybody we talk to.
It wasn't until Megan started interacting with people through the church's own Twitter account in her mid-20s that she started to consider that maybe, instead of saving people through the word of God, maybe her actions were harming others. Maybe she was wrong. Eventually, Megan left the church, which meant also leaving behind her entire family and everything she'd been led to believe about what is right and what is wrong. That was over 10 years ago now, and she's now married to one of the people who challenged her beliefs on Twitter all those years ago. And she's a mother of 2 children, one who's now almost the exact same age she was when she started holding up those God hates signs. She's since made a living out of telling her incredible story, using her own example of how her belief system could be challenged to show the power of changing people's minds through conversations in good faith. After all, it's what helped her discover who she truly is. That is what motivated her to reach out to someone who's turned out to be one of the most controversial figures of our time, author of the Harry Potter series, JK Rowling. JK's outspoken views on the trans community's impact and what she perceives as real women has seen people disown the previously beloved author and rejecting her stories that they once believed showed compassion and support for anyone who dared to be different in this or even a magical world. Megan made a podcast called The Witch Trials of JK Rowling, where she sat down with the author and discussed why she believes the things she does. And it's been met with a fair amount of controversy.
I never set out to upset anyone. However, I was not uncomfortable with getting off my pedestal.
But for Megan, it's not about choosing a side. It's about listening, learning and conversation, asking ourselves whether we can ever make progress without listening to each other. Here's Megan Phelps-Roper. I wanted to start off by asking you what your memories are during that time when you're on social media and you have that aha moment where you're starting to learn that maybe the teachings of your family aren't right. Mm-hmm. Do you remember those thoughts and feelings you were having during that process and the moment that you realised that maybe what my family and I have been doing has been hurtful and hateful. What were those moments like in your mind when you finally started to have that realization?
So it's a process. The conversations I was having on Twitter and okay, sorry. Just like going back to this place, it's been a while. It's really interesting because this morning, I was thinking about a few of them just because of some random coincidences that have like sort of brought these specific moments back to mind. But it was things like when Amy Winehouse died. And, I'd been on Twitter for a while at this point, and this is just another example of one of these moments where my family in real life, I'm surrounded by people who are celebrating, saying in her case, well, she was a whore and she was a drug addict and, kind of focusing on her sins and how this is an example of the condign wrath of God, well-deserved for her sins. And at the same time, I'm on Twitter and seeing the world kind of mourning this incredible talent, that, she was only, I think, 27, when she died. She was quite young.
I'm not sure how anyone with a soul can make jokes about the passing of one of the most talented artists this generation will see.
Just heard about Amy Winehouse. How horribly sad. Just so sad.
R.I.P. Amy Winehouse. Heartbreaks for her family, and may she find the peace she was looking for.
And one of those people was the man who would eventually become my husband. At the time, he was just, an anonymous person on Twitter, but who had kind of been asking me questions and listening to my answers and really engaging with what I was saying. And it made me, partly because I felt, in retrospect, I was feeling heard. I was also curious about, his thoughts. And, as I'm seeing this kind of disparate reaction between the people I'm surrounded by in real life versus the people I'm surrounded by online, there started to be some discomfort. And especially as, the more I started to see other people's reactions in a way that they were becoming human to me, in other words, in a way that they had never been, when I'm standing on a picket line and people are coming up and yelling and spitting and attacking my family and me. It's very hard to engage across that kind of divide. And on Twitter, it was happening all the time, where I'm not just seeing them as they're being aggressive toward my family. I'm seeing them in their own environments. They're posting photos of their children, and I'm watching those children grow up. I'm just seeing aspects of their lives that I just had not been really privy to before that. And so those moments were very uncomfortable and kind of terrifying, because as I'm have these feelings that are going against the doctrine that I had been raised in my entire life, I am afraid that this is, kind of showing, like I'm engaging in humanistic thinking is the way that my family thinks about it. I am starting to replace the judgments of God with my own judgments, with these fallible human judgments. So I kind of would instinctively double down. I would go back to the Bible, the verses that justified the things that I believed. And so that went on for about a year and a half, I think. I said it's a process. So it happens kind of a little bit at a time where these questions and doubts start to grow. But there also was a moment when I finally realized, like, oh my God, maybe we're not just wrong about one or two or three of these, relatively small points of doctrine that have come up in these conversations. Maybe our understanding of the world is fundamentally flawed in some way. And for me, that moment came. I was going over these things again and again in my mind as I'm painting a wall in my friend's basement with my sister, who had shared many of these concerns with me. And when that moment, came, and literally it was like, what if we're just people? Was the way that it came into my mind. Like, what if these are not the judgments of an infallible God? What if this thing that I've been taught was unquestionable is actually entirely questionable, and not just questionable, but truly destructive and, not really the way that the world works? And it's a terrifying thought because of all of the implications of that. It meant that I had spent my life, dedicated my life and my energy and all of my resources to this ministry that was not this unqualified good. And I had to acknowledge, to myself that this had been wrong and destructive, just like everybody had been arguing to me all those years. It's a really stark thing. I mean, just on that level, but it goes even deeper than that because, of course, my entire life is wrapped up in the church. My whole family is wrapped up in the church. Everybody that I loved. And knowing that if that thought was true, if we are just people, then I am going to leave and I'm going to lose everyone. And I'm going to go out into a world that I have spent my entire life demonizing. And no one will have any reason to give me a second chance. And it's hard to describe the magnitude of what that moment meant for my life.
It's so interesting that your sort of enlightenment in this came from a social media platform that pretty much the entire world agrees is a bit of a cesspool and potentially one of the worst of the lot. So it's really interesting that Twitter was the place that managed to capture your mind and set you free.
Well, I mean, it's really funny because I've thought about this a lot. And I just to be, frank, at this point, I do see the way that a lot of bad comes from places like Twitter. I think part of the reason it was good for me is that, again, coming from the picket line, like it's hard to get worse than that. It's even less optimized for dialogue than Twitter is. And I had a very thick skin because I was used to that. By the time I'm on Twitter, I'm in my early 20s. I've spent almost 2 decades by then because we started protesting when I was 5 years old. So I was very used to it. I was very used to getting attacked. I was very used to essentially brushing it off, except maybe like the most extreme things, the comments that I would get on Twitter. So I was used to all of that, where I think for a lot of people, it is a huge deterrent. They're not willing to engage when that is, the environment that they're in. But for me, like there was a difference because of that ability to build rapport over time, which was crucial, I think, to my being able to really hear and understand where other people were coming from.
Well, can you take us back to 5-year-old Megan? Because I have an 8-year-old daughter now. You have a daughter yourself.
She's 4.5. It's so funny. I hadn't thought
She's 4.5. So she is so very close to the age that you were when you were holding up signs saying terrible, terrible things. Can you imagine when you look at your daughter now with the teachings of the Westboro Baptist Church behind you and all of the things that you were exposed to at her age, can you imagine sending your daughter out to do that work? Does it make you question your parents' decisions?
It's really interesting because I actually hadn't thought about that, specifically tying it to her age in this moment. Like my instinct is to protect her. I would say what it really helps me understand, and I knew this already, but as I move kind of further and further away from Westboro's view of the world as more years pass and I have more experiences myself that kind of make me more intuitively understand outsiders in the way that I do understand Westboro. It just makes me think, like, I know that my parents believed that we were doing an essential good. Like this was the truth of God and he would protect us. And, again, the strength of those beliefs, I knew that. But as a parent now, that has to be true. Or else there's no way that they would have sent, because I'm the third of 11 children. There was no way that they would have sent, and brought all of us out there if this wasn't something that they believed was absolutely true and righteous and good and necessary. If they had thought there was another option, they wouldn't have done it.
Have you, and I'm presuming you have, considered where the extremist views from your family came from? I know your grandfather, Fred, was the driving force behind where the church ended up going, but where did his extremist beliefs come from, you think, to the point that it would involve your entire family and, you've already mentioned this, but putting them through some pretty awful things, being attacked, being targeted, and we'll get into some of the reactions that you've had to some of the things that you have done over the years a little bit later, but where do you think that extremist thinking originated from?
I think my grandfather was extraordinarily intelligent and he had a sense of righteousness, again, that made him feel, and also not just righteousness, but certainty. He was so certain that his understanding of the world was the truth, the capital T truth. And because he was so smart and because he could marshal, all of these resources to support that position. So it wasn't just that, Westboro read the Bible and memorized it and memorized our understanding of it to be able to deploy it in these debates on the picket line every day. It was also that we looked around all the time at what other people believed and memorized the Bible verses that showed why they were wrong. So it was a constant process of examination. And my Gramps was just so certain that, and I didn't realize this part till later, but the two premises on which everything else at Westboro, all of the rest of our ideology sit, is the idea that the Bible is the literal, infallible word of God, and that Westboro's understanding of it was the only true version of it, or interpretation of it, understanding of it.
We're making the rounds because we got a point to make. You don't have enough collective wisdom, plans, or power. When God decides to destroy this earth in his wrath, you will not be able to stop it. We're doing a service, a kindness to our fellow man.
So if you accept those two things, essentially everything else about our ideology followed. My grandfather was an attorney and required his children also to be attorneys. So I think 11 of the 13 went to law school. So it was this process of examination, and it was like, as long as we had an answer for all the questions that people threw at us, we had the sense that this is the unquestionable truth of God. See, nobody can even come up with an argument against what we believe. And so again, it gives you the sense that the certainty that you feel is because it is the unquestionable truth of God. And that sense, like if you believe that, if you are truly certain that your ideas are unquestionable, it allows you to justify all kinds of terrible things. So because we have the truth of God, it makes perfect sense to go and protest funerals and try to warn people away from these sins that will take them to hell. So because we're certain, maybe if we were less certain, our willingness to justify a lot of the horrible things that we said and did. This is one of the lessons that I've taken from my experience, is that certainty was a really dangerous thing, ultimately, not just in my family, but for humanity in general. To bring it back to the question that you actually asked, I think his understanding, his sense of certainty is a big part of it. And then another part of it is that these ideas didn't originate with my Gramps. The fact that he would look back at other expositors, Bible commentators, and I would read these things and go back and look at, Puritan theology, and I would find a lot of comfort and solace in the fact that even though people today don't believe these things, this was once very common, like the common understanding of who God is and how God works. So that historical element, I think, was very powerful to me, and I think it was to my Gramps as well. He saw other people's diverging from those historical patterns as evidence that they had apostatized, and we hadn't. We were holding to the truth as everyone used to believe.
What does 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old Megan understand of the signs that she's carrying when she's picketing with her family? And I know in your book you talk a lot about not all the time was it really a connection in your brain as to them being real people, and often it was just about walking up and down that patch of grass over and over again for days and days and days. But what did you understand as a young child about the content of the signs that you were holding when they're saying awful things like God hates fags? What's your understanding of what you're saying in that time?
I think it's a very simple understanding, which is, this is the idea, again, just a very foundational belief that we had. The job of human beings is to obey God. God is the creator. We are the clay in his hands to mold as he pleases, and our job is to obey him. So I believed that the people that we were protesting were not obeying God. And because they were being disobedient, it was our job to go and warn them. And so, it was a very general understanding. Like, I didn't know at first what it meant to be gay. And that changed pretty quickly because as I wrote in my book, my grandfather could be extremely explicit in his sermons, like describing the sex acts that gay people engage in, or at least as he understood it. And, eventually that becomes, very clear. But for the most part, it was just that very simple, everybody's job is to obey God, and they're not obeying, and that's why God is cursing them, so we have to go and warn them. So we really believed that what we were doing was the very definition of loving our neighbor. We thought that in going and warning people, we were giving them the opportunity to, if God would have mercy on them and turn their hearts, that this preaching would be the mechanism that God used to save people. And so we saw it as loving our neighbor. So it was from the beginning, I was so certain that we were doing right and we were doing good, and everybody else was just led astray.
Were you actually turning hearts? Were you actually saving people? Was there ever moments where you thought, yes, success, the actions that we are taking is actually working?
So the other side of the coin is that if God doesn't use that preaching, like it is the only hope for people, but if God doesn't use it to turn your heart, then he uses it to harden your heart. So because we believed that the way that people responded to us was not in our power, it wasn't our prerogative, it was God's prerogative how people responded. All we could do was be clear and obedient to the message that God had given. And, people would say things like, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. And my gramps would say, we're not trying to catch flies, we're trying to preach the word of God. And so it was this very stark message, and there was no getting around it. There are a lot of things in the Bible, some of them are very appealing to a lot of people, and some of them are very unappealing. And one of the ones that I think is unappealing to a lot of people is that idea of, you have to submit yourself to this unquestionable authority. And so it made perfect sense. We would quote these Bible verses. Jesus would talk about, blessed are you when men will hate you and revile you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my name's sake. And, people hated Jesus. We would say they crucified Christ. So of course they're going to hate us as well. So there was always an answer for why people responded the way that they did. And that was also very powerful. Before I ever experienced those things, I knew the verses that told me how people were going to respond. And that just, again, made it seem even more proof that we were doing the right thing and other people were wrong.
Do you know what's really interesting in your book when you write about when you're younger is that your childhood seems unusually normal and abnormal at the same time, in that at the same time as you're picketing, carrying these awful signs and being really strict in your devotion to your faith, you're also going to a mainstream school and singing pop songs and watching mainstream TV shows that you would presume someone who's in a stricter faith as what you were would be banned from watching and participating in. Mm-hmm. Was it weird to have kind of that two-faceted childhood where it's so mainstream and yet so not at the same time?
The fact that we weren't, as we would say, we weren't freaks. We would look at some of the other Christian communities who were much stricter than we were in some ways and much less strict in other ways. Our exposure to pop culture, our engagement in society, the fact that, many had just mainstream, they just worked in normal jobs. And that was evidence that you could be in the world, but not of the world. It's really interesting because when some of those more strict Christians would say, why do you let your daughters wear shorts? And why do you let your children watch television or listen to mainstream music? These are corrupting influences. And my family would point to these, verses in the Bible about how we are supposed to be watchers. How can we preach about the sins of the world if we are not paying attention, if we close ourselves off to know what we should be preaching about? And it is really interesting too. There was a point at which, as I was looking back, shortly after I left and realizing that even though we were exposed to all of those things, before we were ever exposed to them, just like those arguments on the picket line, I knew what people were going to say. I knew what I was going to encounter in these books and had already had the answer firmly planted in my brain so that when I encountered a premarital relationship in a book, I didn't think, oh, that's something I should do or emulate. It was oh, those people are whores, and don't even think twice about it. This is the language in my brain as a child. And so the analogy that I came up with was it's like being inoculated against those ideas. And the fact that the church could tell me in advance that this was going to happen, and then it happened. It's just like everything seems to confirm what the church says, which is why when I finally did encounter these inconsistencies much later on Twitter in my 20s, it was so overwhelming. Like, how is it possible that I've gone my whole life where everything seems to show that we are the good guys, and now to encounter this thing that is showing me that we could be wrong, that we are wrong.
What was school like for you? I mean, high school, when most of us find it a pretty trying time in our lives with hormones and all the things going on. What was that like for you being in a mainstream school? Your school peers obviously know your family and know that you're part of that movement who does man the picket line, that you yourself are one of them. How do you cope with that on top of your sort of standard teenage experiences?
Not only did they know that we were part of that movement, I was going every week and protesting my own school during the lunch, crossing the parking lot, crossing the street, picking up a sign and eating my lunch as my classmates are driving by, you know, screaming and yelling and like throwing food at us and stuff. And then we go and like sit next to each other in class and they're asking to copy my work and such. Like there's that sort of extreme side of the church, and then there's the mainstream side of the church. And I think a lot of people had a hard time reconciling those. I mean, as much as we would have ourselves. And so a lot of people compartmentalized. I think I compartmentalized because some of the same people that would, you know, go by, you know, making fun of us or whatever, literally I would be sitting with them in class like the next hour and we're talking about the assignment, like we're in the same group project. And, you know, compartmentalization, I think, is maybe one of the only ways to really deal with that. And yeah, I don't know. I think my mom and other members of the church, they would talk about us, you know, the children in public schools as walking picket signs. So even to hear our names, you know, people think God hates gays. You know, of course, the more extreme version of that statement. And we were very proud of that. We were proud that when they would say, you know, bad things about us, we saw ourselves as a testimony against them because we were polite and we were kind and we were friendly and we, you know, got really good grades and we were earnest, zealous students. And it's a dichotomy that I think a lot of people had a hard time wrapping their heads around.
So talk me through what leaving school and sort of heading out into the world was like for you. It's interesting when you say that the teachings of your church has given you a response to every single scenario. But did you ever, when you went out into the world, be confronted by scenarios where you felt like you didn't have the answer from your faith?
No, it sounds crazy to say that now because you would think that there would be some. Every single night we were studying the Bible. We were reading it together as a family. I'm the third of 11, like I said. And because I knew it wasn't just random people, it was also journalists, documentary filmmakers. And I was a really zealous believer, but it's also true that part of it was the knowledge that I was going to have to defend all of these things. And so it caused me to really dig in deep, you know, not just memorizing the verse, but again, reading the expositors and looking at the history and wanting to be prepared always to give an answer, as the Bible said, to exhort and confound the gainsayer. And so it truly wasn't until I got on Twitter that it's partly because Westboro signs, I mean, in general, it was 3 to 5 words on a picket sign, and people would come by and they would read the sign. And in general, they would have no sense of the massive amount of exposition, you know, of that sign, like where it came from, what it meant, what we meant by it. And because of that, like people were just not, in general, they were not engaging with what we actually believed. So when they say we were hateful, you know, as I mentioned earlier, like we didn't see ourselves as hateful. We saw ourselves as loving. So when people are accusing us of, you know, being monstrous hate mongers, it just didn't connect. What Twitter did was it helped people really understand what we were saying and where we were coming from in a way that was just very hard to do when you're just engaging with the picket signs themselves. So again, it sounds maybe arrogant. It's probably more like short-sighted to say that I never encountered that in real life, but that's my memory of it.
But you mentioned journalists, documentary filmmakers. I mean, Louis Theroux obviously is the most famous of the lot, who followed your family both when you were in the church and after you left.
They knew that I didn't agree with what they represented, and they really didn't care. And so there's this real honesty to the relationship.
There's obviously a lot of footage and photos of you on the picket lines saying those awful things.
Mm-hmm. If you see your neighbor sinning and you don't warn them, what you're doing is you're tacitly enabling and encouraging them on their way to hell. That's not loving your neighbor. So how can you love your neighbor unless you're out here?
So this is about love.
This is about love, exactly. This is the definition of love.
What does it feel like for you to look back on those videos and photos of yourself in that moment? How does it feel inside to remember you as that person?
It's very strange. And I would say more recently, it's become a lot more painful. So the strange part is I tried not to look at any of that stuff for about the first year after I left the church. And then when I would look at it, it was such a strange feeling because I would know exactly where I was coming from, like why I was saying those things. But because I didn't believe it anymore, and because there was this kind of chasm between who I was when I was saying those things and who I was at the moment I was watching them, it was like being forced to say something that I didn't actually believe. Like, I don't know, maybe today you would say like, it's like watching an AI version of yourself, sort of, and like trying to figure out how to describe this massive change from the certainty I felt in the moment when I was saying those things to coming to this point where I don't believe these things. And I know all the reasons why, but like, again, trying to articulate it was like very difficult. But in The Witch Trials of JK Rowling, there are some references to my past and my story. And when we were writing, the beginning of episode 6, which is where the first time we really dive in deep to any of that. And I was looking at a lot of these old clips, and it was really painful in ways that surprised me because I couldn't get through that section, either reading it in my own head or reading it aloud without crying. And I was trying to figure out, like, why is this becoming harder to talk about? And I think the answer is that I now, after 10 years that I've spent with members of the community and in relationships with members of these communities that we used to target, and also just with my own experiences now living in the world and outside of that ideology. And as a mom myself with 2 children who I adore, when I look back at those things and think about the parents and the loved ones of those people, Westboro, we had this sign, God hates your feelings. And so I was very accustomed to my whole life dismissing the thoughts and the feelings of outsiders. And as those thoughts and feelings and experiences have become mine, as I've come to understand them intuitively and not just intellectually, it's really painful to go back because I'm not just seeing myself anymore. I'm really seeing the people in that moment that we were hurting. And so even after I left, though, there was a time when the pain that we caused other people, some of it, like I could feel it, but a lot of it was still intellectual. And so I would say, like, just over time, the experience of, I was very deliberate about putting myself in a position to have those views challenged. I was not trying to hold on to them. I was trying to see, how do other people see this? How have other people come to different conclusions? What are their thoughts and experiences and opinions that have led them to this other place? And to engage with that. And that was really scary at first, but it was incredibly helpful and amazing, honestly, that people were willing to, have the grace to engage with me and to share those things with me, their thoughts and feelings and experiences, instead of just writing me off as, somebody who is irredeemable and who can never, change, or who could never, make up for or repair any of the damage that I did when I was at the church. And so their willingness to be open with me, like I said, almost from the very beginning, right after I left, I don't know who I would be in the absence of that grace that those people showed me. So many people.
After the break, I asked Megan if her experience leaving the church was what led her to reach out to Jo Rowling, despite her notoriously private life. Is that gratitude for the way those people helped you what led you to reach out to JK Rowling after all the controversy that she's faced?
I don't really care for JK Rowling, unfortunately, because the comments that she's made I don't agree with. I think to have the author of these beautiful, loving, accepting stories hurting marginalized communities, it sucks.
Yeah, she's super transphobic. She's a TERF. She's pretty terrible. I really wish this was not the hill she chose to die on.
I think there was a lot of things that made me reach out to her. You know, I mentioned how much Twitter, was a good in my own life. But as I was watching the conversation, not just on sex and gender, but on many topics, I think social media has been, or has become at this point, a net negative, to say the least. And the fact that so many of these difficult conversations are being had on social media, that was not a good thing. And because of my experience at Westboro, I just have this deep belief in the power of good faith conversation to bridge divides that seem unbridgeable. And I think that's definitely the case with this conversation on sex and gender. I think there's such a lack of understanding. There is a kind of conflation of the extremes with, I think, the much more widespread mainstream opinions. And it causes this kind of cycle of demonization. And it just seemed like there was a space, or there should be a space, to address those things, like with good faith people on all sides.
So you write a letter to Jo Rowling and you say, can we have a conversation about this? And then she actually responds. In that moment, do you go, yes, this is the opportunity that I've been looking for to have these conversations, or did you do a little, oh shit, and now we need to have these conversations?
I would say definitely the latter. I mean, I had just found out I was pregnant. And so I was very grateful, first of all, like that she might be willing, because at the beginning, it wasn't a sure thing. It was like the beginning of a conversation about, can we have a conversation about having a conversation? But I mean, like, it wasn't just to talk about sex and gender. It was really, if you've listened to the show, like, it is a much bigger conversation. It is about the way that the world has changed and society's changed over the last 20 or 30 years, and the role that the internet and social media have played in that. And, trying to tell this much bigger story about human nature and using this conversation around sex and gender as kind of one major piece of that. And that conversation is also it's one that I think a lot of people find it very hard to follow, partly because the language, like for the uninitiated, the language is hard to parse even. And because that conversation has become so toxic, people are afraid even to ask questions about it and to really dive in. And so it was such a huge conversation that we were asking for. And like I said, I'm really grateful that she was willing. It was also terrifying because I've never interviewed someone before. I've never conducted an interview before I sat down with JK Rowling the first time in Scotland. And so I wondered, am I equal to this task? Obviously, I have good intentions, but I want to make sure that I'm doing something that is not going to inadvertently do harm. So there was a whole lot of consideration. A lot of that stuff also happened even before I wrote the letter to her. So sorry, again, I feel like I'm getting off track here a little bit, but there was also this feeling before I wrote to her that we realized the concept for the show we had, but as we, started doing research, we realized we can't tell the story without her voice and her perspective. And the likelihood that she would say yes was so impossibly remote. She doesn't give interviews often. She certainly never gives these kind of long form interviews, like only very rarely. And it's been, I don't know when the last time she's done something like this, maybe the Oprah interview in 2007. It's been a long time. So the likelihood that she would say yes was so impossibly remote that if it did work, that if she did say yes, that it was almost like maybe, I don't believe in God anymore, but I just had a sense of maybe there's something telling us that we should do this. It still honestly seems incredibly surreal that this whole thing has fallen out this way.
Get big, deep breaths.
Yoga move.
All right.
Let's do it.
So you travel to Scotland and you walk into Jo Rowling's castle. What was that first meeting like with her? Did you feel like this was a conversation that was going to be fruitful? Did you feel like it was going to be an uphill battle? How was that first interaction with her?
Well, the first interaction was actually we had to go and set up all of this audio equipment. So that was the day before our first conversation. She was very warm and very generous, easy to talk to right away. But it wasn't until we sat down the next day, and like I said, I felt, you hear it actually in episode 1, the first question that I asked her, which was, it might seem, as you listen, as kind of a strange question to start with about, why humans like stories about magic. And I remember the reason I asked that question, it was like a warm-up question, before we, get into, the main part of the interview.
I'm very interested in this because I think it speaks to something very profound in human nature. Magic gives a person agency they wouldn't otherwise have. And I think that's particularly appealing to a child because children inevitably are quite powerless.
Her answer was so thoughtful and kind of lovely that we were like, okay, we have to include this. But also her answer to that made me feel oh my God, I am not smart enough to do this. But the second question, I barely got out that question, that the first one that kind of dives into her history. And I don't know, I had this impression, you read stuff about how private she is. And I wasn't sure how much she wanted to get into that. And how much we would have to try to use archival tape to tell that part of the story. But she wasn't like that at all. She was incredibly open. She was immediately willing to go back, this very deep dive into parts of her history that she has not spoken about before. And that really surprised me. It was not what I expected, but I was really grateful for it because I think there's so much, part of the reason that her story is the lens through which we look to tell this bigger story about society and about human nature is because her story intersects with so many people's stories. So many women have this history similar to Rowling's as a survivor of domestic violence and sexual assault, as the Me Too movement, showed us very clearly. So many people have, memories and formative experiences with Harry Potter as this cultural force that, shaped the morality of an entire generation of people. And then also, Rowling is raising concerns that many people share. And those concerns don't go away if they're suppressed. One of the journalists that I spoke with for the show and who has covered this topic for a long time, Michelle Goldberg at the New York Times now, she said this thing that I found really fascinating. She said, the seeds of the backlash are contained within the effort to suppress questions and dissent and the effort to kind of force a consensus when it hasn't been reached organically through conversation and persuasion, which is, how pluralistic societies function. And so, I think there's a reason that she hasn't talked to a lot of, other journalists. She said, at least 100 people had asked her, explain yourself, explain yourself, explain yourself. But I was really grateful that she was willing to go there because I think in truly understanding where she's coming from and representing the concerns, I think, of a lot of women in particular, that's the point at which people can really engage with the points that she's actually making. And the show is never meant to be the final word on any of these things. I wasn't trying to legislate all of these points. It was really just an exercise in perspective taking, trying to make sure that the best, good faith positions were being shared so that the conversation could continue with the people who can legislate those issues, who can actually have the conversation and try to find places where, I don't know if compromise is the right word, but some sense of understanding and a productive way forward. And that was what my background at Westboro, and specifically leaving Westboro, it has led me to believe very strongly in the power of those conversations.
Do you think you've actually achieved that? You've had some backlash from even people who were involved in the show who've said that they now regret being involved in the show, that there's been members of the trans community who say what this has essentially done is given it more focus on the anti-trans movement and given people more fodder to come at them with reasons why they shouldn't be allowed in spaces where they shouldn't exist. Do you feel like you actually achieved that open dialogue that you were looking for, or do you feel like maybe some of it has harmed people by airing this conversation?
So first of all, one person did disavow the series before any part of it had aired, Natalie Wynn, who's featured heavily in episode 6.
Last year, I received an email from Megan Phelps-Roper, estranged daughter of the Westboro Baptist Church. She asked if I'd give an interview for a podcast on JK Rowling, the world's foremost champion of backlash to trans rights. I agreed. This was a serious lapse in judgment. The fundamental problem is that Megan only understands bigotry from the bigot's point of view. Megan doesn't seem to grasp that trans people are fighting for our lives, our right to exist in society. I regret my participation and wouldn't have participated had I fully understood the nature of the project. I feel that I've been used, and I share the sentiments of other trans people who are speaking out against it.
When I read that Twitter thread, I immediately went back to all the communication that I had had with her in writing and made sure, did I mislead her somehow? I don't believe we did. I think that the show is exactly what I pitched to her. And I really hope that if she has gone back or does go back and actually listen to the series, that she will see that it is exactly the conversation that I had pitched to her. So that's one thing. Another thing is, again, the conversation is happening. It was already happening. It was just happening on social media where you were seeing the most shallow and the most extreme versions of all these arguments. And that makes it very difficult for people to really engage with what the other side believes, as opposed to a caricature of what the other side believes. And so while, yes, I completely understand there are some trans people who believe that it was not a good thing to talk to JK Rowling and to share that side of the conversation, I have also heard from many trans people who say that it was a good thing and that it is important to have the conversation because they are, as one friend of mine who is trans put it to me, that we are asking for a change in society here, a significant change. And if we don't make the case for it and try to instead impose this kind of top down, to force it, we are doing ourselves a disservice. And we don't want people like JK Rowling and women who have similar positions to feel like we are ignoring their concerns. So I don't think that there can sometimes be this sense that trans people are a monolith. And I don't believe that's true. And now, having spent so much time talking to trans people about this, I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't had those conversations both before I wrote to Rowling, before, during, and since the show has been published, having those conversations. And so I totally understand where people are coming from. I also just think that there can sometimes be this sort of, I don't know if utopianism is the right word, but it is, the idea that by not engaging with those ideas, that somehow they can be surpassed or that we can get through this without actually addressing them. Even now, looking at my own story, right? I can say, I believe Westboro is wrong. I was wrong. And yet my mind could not change without being persuaded. I had a lifetime of experience that led me to those positions. And there's something that can be very frustrating about the fact it's just a thing about human nature, that suppressing these ideas doesn't stop them from spreading. And they just have to be engaged with. And that's a frustrating, difficult thing. And not everybody can do it. But I very firmly believe in that. And I know I'm not the only one. I don't know another way to get through this. And I'll say just very last thing, and then I'll stop talking about this. But one of the things that was so fascinating to me was that in having so many conversations with people on all sides of this conflict is how much overlap there is actually when it comes down to even the specific policy issues. You hear, Natalie Wynn in episode 6, talking about where is the line of fairness when it comes to trans women in women's sports.
I am willing to engage with someone who is skeptical, for example, about is it fair for trans women to be in sports? Because I don't know, that's it's honestly a question I have myself. But I feel like my willingness to engage with that is going to decrease if it's with someone who I think doesn't really believe in trans acceptance at a much more fundamental level, which is kind of the feeling that I get from Jo Rowling.
Nobody wants to sort of rush children through, youth, gender, specifically medical transition. So there is actually a lot of overlap in the positions, and it's hard to tell that when you're looking at, again, the most extreme versions of the arguments on social media. So I'm not trying to, deny, anybody's, sense that, if they feel like this was harmful. I very much regret that. I do hope that in the end, that it will be clear that real good has come from this. And okay, oh my gosh, sorry, one more thing. I was going to say, I have heard from so many people on the gender critical side who said, I listened to this series and I went in as a very staunch supporter of JK Rowling, and I was challenged, and I am rethinking my positions about things. Like, I take all of these things very seriously, and there is no optimal solution, I guess maybe is the last thing I'll say. There's no optimal solution, but I do feel like a lot of good has come from the show, and we have done everything we can to try to make sure that's the case, but it also won't be fixed with one show.
What listening to the show definitely did for me is understand that finding the centre of an argument is very difficult, and that pulling the extremes in from the sides is also incredibly difficult because your brain wants to lean one way or the other. Mm-hmm. It's human nature, I think, to lean one way or the other. So to pull your brain in, and which is something which is incredible with the way that you left the Westboro Church, in that you were able to pull your brain from one extreme back to the centre, because it's not human nature to do that. So is your hope that maybe you can just pull more people towards the centre of this argument?
What I really hope is that the friends and acquaintances of mine who are trans, who spoke like what I just mentioned, this sense of we are asking for a change and we have to have the conversation to make that happen. I really hope that in listening, first, that people feel that their position has been fairly represented, that they're not being strawmanned somehow. And then also that they can understand where the other side is coming from, even when they vehemently disagree. And we did that. It was with trans people and with, feminists like JK Rowling, but we also did it with, Christians in episode 2. And, the people who were part of that original backlash against JK Rowling and the Harry Potter books for promoting witchcraft. It's not that you listen because you want to agree, or I'm not trying to force people to change their minds. It's in understanding where the other side is actually coming from. You, I think, tend to be more willing to engage, right? If you think that the other side is irredeemable hate mongers, what reason do you have to try to engage in persuasion? You tend to lean into the certainty of we are right, they are wrong, we are good, they are bad. And so therefore we are justified in using force and violence to sort of try to force the other side to submit to our way of seeing things. And to my mind, I don't think that's the best path to change. I remember, at one point realizing there's this sense often that people have that listening is like agreeing. If you are even willing to listen to what the other side believes, that you are somehow betraying your side, or that empathizing is itself a betrayal. It is dangerous in some way. And, again, to my mind, those are just the tools of effective persuasion. And I think the path forward, the best path forward, the most productive path forward is by leaning on those tools rather than on trying to shut down people who disagree. That might be possible sometimes. And imagine if it's like Westboro, right? This country, many states in this country have passed laws to try to limit Westboro's preaching, especially at funerals, but in general as well. And so maybe it's this tiny minority, but again, JK Rowling's positions are shared by many people. And in a, pluralistic society, the way that we find a way forward is through conversation and persuasion. I just don't see a better way. I'm open to it. I would love to hear other people's ideas, but I don't know what a viable alternative that doesn't involve force and violence, which I don't agree with. I don't think that's the way.
Well, it's now been 10 years, over 10 years since you left the church, and by default also leaving your family, because that's how the church works. Mm-hmm. You can't be a member of your family if you're not also a member of your church. Some of your other siblings have also left too, so it's not everybody, but majority of them. Mm-hmm. And when you scroll through your social media, you get a real sense of longing, especially for your mum and your close members of your family who you seem to miss terribly. Other than those people who are still close to you, who you still love dearly, do you miss anything about being a part of that church? Is it the certainty of just knowing everything. Do you miss anything about those days?
There's a lot that I mourned when I left. I did love that certainty so much. Like, there was no existential angst at Westboro Baptist Church. And, now I love the doubt. I'm suspicious of certainty because, again, of my experience with it. But just the feeling of it, like the sense that I knew exactly what I was doing in life. I knew what was right and what was wrong and how I should spend my days. And there was those questions are hard to deal with, which I think is one of the things that makes groups like that and certainty like that so appealing. But the thing I would say that I really miss, and there was a moment 3 years after I left the church where it kind of just really hit me, that the sense of community that I had at Westboro, in being part of this small group and having that sense of, it's us against the world, it just had the effect of making those bonds incredibly tight. We were so close. We were willing to do anything for each other. And this moment came to me as I'm like sweeping this, we have a kind of big room on the back of our house. And I kind of flashed back to these moments where I was, working on cleaning, but instead of being alone, I was with a whole bunch of people. And, we again, drop everything, wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and go and shovel the driveways for, of snow for, everybody in the neighborhood before school, helping the moms take care of their kids. And, it's just that sense of community and togetherness and willingness to sacrifice. I realized it's not something that I've just lost for a while. That kind of community doesn't really exist in the real world, outside of cults and maybe the military. I realized later. And more than anything, it's just that the people themselves, I know those people and I know that they are well-intentioned, that they are kind-hearted. And I know it's very hard for some people to recognize because it seems like it is, directly in tension, the idea of being kind-hearted and engaging in the kind of protest that they do. But in another environment and another kind of ideology, they would be doing incredible things. And I wish so strongly and so deeply that that other world existed. And that the one that I now live, where I am telling my daughter, I talk to her about my parents and my siblings all the time. And I wish that she could know them herself and that it wasn't something that was so painful in this way.
Well, that was quite an incredible conversation, and I'm incredibly grateful to Megan for taking the time to speak to me. It can't be easy to be open about such raw and very painful and sometimes very shameful parts of your past. If you'd like to listen to The Witch Trials of JK Rowling, it's a fascinating series and it really illustrates what Megan's talking about when it comes to open conversations. It will make your mind bend a little bit too and question what you think and believe. We've linked to it in the show notes. The producer of No Filter is Emmeline Peterson. Our executive producer is Eliza Ratliff, with sound production by Madeline Joannou. And I'm Claire Murphy. Thanks for listening.